Please welcome Genevieve Bell.
Apparently, I don't need the podium. That's good. It's always my pleasure to be at events like this, and it's a privilege to be here. It's lovely to be back with my extended Intel family and to get to share the stage with some astonishing minds. My role at events like this is usually to do something a little bit different, and today is no exception. I realize I'm going to be a disappointment. I have no demos, I have no tech, I have no video, I have no code. You've just got me. And attempting to open up a conversation about ethics, because I think that's a conversation we should be having over and over and over again. So for the next half an hour, you get to listen to me talk about ethics. I know, I'm sorry. So there's lots of ways to introduce myself. Here are the important pieces you need to know. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. I have a PhD from Stanford in cultural anthropology. I spent the last 20 years working at Intel, where my job was to study human beings and think about their relationships with and to new technology. These days, I'm also a professor of computer science and engineering in my home country, Australia, at the Australian National University. There, I'm responsible for directing a centre that's exploring next-generation cyber-physical systems, artificial intelligence, and autonomous tech, with an eye to building a new kind of way of thinking about things. So I spend a lot of time thinking and worrying about the questions of ethics, and it comes up a lot. When I said yes to doing this event, I realized, however, there were a couple of things we probably needed to do at the very beginning. One was to actually define our terms, because I realized we talk a lot about ethics, but there's actually some other things going on in there. So this is how you know I've become a professor, because now there are definitions on my slides. So ethics, let's start with that. Well, that's about moral principles that govern a person's behavior. So principles, right? An idea of morals. Morality is something slightly different. That's how we distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad. Bias, which we also talk about in the AI space, is something quite different. Bias is about a prejudice in favor of or against something or a person or a group, usually in a way that's unfair. And then there are laws, so systems of rules. Now, what all of those definitions should immediately make clear, well, is that those are all human artifacts. They are not computational systems. That means they're really hard to implement and instrument. It also means that all of those terms are cultural. Ethics are different in different countries. Rules are different in different countries. They've changed over the arc of my lifetime and all of you in this room. If you grew up in Australia or America, there were things that were considered to be good or bad 20 years ago that are different now. Ethics and ideas change over time. But why are we talking about ethics right now, and why with AI? Well, partly it's because things have gotten to scale and the impact is more clear, and we now have to start thinking about risks and trade-offs. But if indeed ethics and morality, those things are cultural and they're contextual, it's a little bit hard to think about how you would talk about them. It's very hard to think about how you would build them. And so you're left with this interesting problem, right? They're very human, which means they are complicated. That doesn't mean you should ignore them, but it does mean that the conversation we're about to have isn't a simple one. There's not one right answer. Now, it turns out that technology has always had an intersection and a complicated relationship to things like ethics, morality, and the law. New technology routinely outpaces society's ability to manage it and to think about it. And it tends to put pressure on all of those systems of judgment and value. And that's been going on for a really long time. Starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, when new technologies created exploitation of small children, when we had to think about kids in mines and kids in chimneys. Those were hard conversations. Things were technically possible, but they turned out to be morally complicated, and changes in law happened. In the 20th century, it's been a lot of things about medicine. So in vitro fertilization, cloning, the birth control pill were all technologies that were possible, but we ended up having debates about whether they were moral or ethical or appropriate. What often happens in those moments in time is that debates happen at a cultural level, and ultimately laws get written to help codify and clarify things. Laws get written to make those conversations more stable, to create a set of expectations and parameters for which all of us should behave. Now, the 19th century was one thing, the 20th was another. We're now in the 21st century, and artificial intelligence and autonomous systems are now also part of this same set of conversations. Even robots fall into this area of a place where we worry about the ethics and morality. One of the challenges, I think, here is that we didn't arrive in this moment unexpectedly. We have 100 years of science fiction in which we have rehearsed dystopian scenarios about what would happen when machinery had artificial intelligence. We have already, in some ways, seen on our movie screens the worst things that could happen. Whether it's stories like Frankenstein or the Terminator sequence, we've, in some ways, played out the ethics and morality of artificial intelligence. So we were already thinking about these things before the technology turned up, and we already had those scenarios. Now, the scenario we spend most of our time talking about at the moment is the trolley problem. And I think in some ways the history of science fiction shapes why it is that that is a problem that has become shorthand for ethics in AI. There's lots of ethical debates we could be having about autonomous vehicles. Does the planet need more cars? How do we think about access to transportation? Who gets to determine where artificial and autonomous vehicles get to go? Those would be ethical debates. The trolley problem is something quite different. This isn't actually about ethics, it's what in philosophy is called an ethical dilemma. The important thing to know about the trolley problem is that this is a classic thought exercise. The choice here between two outcomes, neither one of which is unambiguously the right choice. So basically, there are two not very good choices. How do you decide which one to pick? Of course, the trolley problem predates autonomous vehicles. There was an early version of it in the late 1800s. The one we mostly refer to now was written in 1967 in an article by a British philosopher by the name of Philippa Foot, so a woman from Oxford, who articulates this problem. And she writes it, it's a pretty straightforward one. I have it written down somewhere on a piece of paper. This is the best demo I have. It's what I got. So in her 1967 article, this is the problem she lays out. There's a driver of a runaway tram where he can steer from one narrow track to another. 5 men are working on one track, and 1 man is working on the other track. Anyone on the track he enters is bound to be killed. So effectively, it's that image behind you, right? If the train continues on the track, it kills 5 people. If you switch the train, 1 person dies. The pieces you have to unpack here are about intentionality, causality, and action. At one level, this problem is sometimes stated as if you let the train proceed on the tracks it is already on and do nothing, 5 people die. But at one level, is the train responsible or are you? If you switch the track, i.e. you actively intervene, 1 person dies. So are you then responsible for that 1 death? And of course, how on earth do we determine 5 versus 1? How do we make those trade-offs? Now, what's interesting here is to imagine as we brought that problem from a moral problem from the 1960s to autonomous vehicles, where does AI sit in this? Is AI the metaphoric driver? Is it the train tracks? Is it the tram itself? Where is the locus of decisions being made, and how do we imagine those decisions might get played out? And frankly, why is it that this is the first place we go, is in some ways to the end point? Now, the thing about the trolley problem, I'm sure much to the great consternation of many of my engineering colleagues, there isn't a right answer here. This is the problem, right? This is, in fact, a place where what you have to have is a series of conversations and a series of scenarios and a series of hypotheticals, where you actually have to actively debate what are the trade-offs, how do we think about those, who should be in those conversations. And in some ways, the hard thing to work out as we start to imagine more and more sophisticated computational systems is where will those conversations happen, and how will we know that the thing we are building is about to create one of these problems? So how do you know that you have an ethical dilemma? This one's relatively straightforward. There's a switch in front of you. people tied on one track, people tied on the other. Most ethical dilemmas don't present themselves that neatly. So what does that look like in this area, right? If we talk about AI, the kind of AI in some ways you've been hearing about on this stage, and I know many of you work on. Well, how would we think about something that felt a little bit more approachable and actionable and manageable? Because I'm willing to bet most of you don't want to be building a system where you're thinking, right, is it 5 people or 1 person? That's not, necessarily the only place we're going to have ethical questions. It's not always going to be about moral trade-offs. It's also going to be about the realities of market economics. It will be about risk. It will be about existing laws and regulations. We don't have these conversations in isolation. There's already a whole lot of other pieces that are at work that we need to pay attention to. Because this is a big space, and there are no easy answers. Because in order to think about ethics here, you actually have to also have a conversation about what we imagine is right and wrong, what we imagine is fair and unfair. And those are ultimately very human conversations, not technical conversations. And they're not conversations, again, to which there is always a clear and agreed understanding. So how would you start to go about doing this in this space, right? What would it look like with ethics and AI? Well, for me, one of the challenges has always been about how do we define AI to start off with, right? Is it just about algorithms or is it more? If you go back to the early days, and I heard Naveen talking about this back in 1956, we know there were notions about what was propelling AI forward. For me, it's always been about a constellation of technologies. Certainly, it's about sensing and sensors, it's about reasoning and strategy, it's about algorithms, it's about teaching and training methodologies. I happen to think you also have to include data in this conversation, because without data, it's pretty hard to imagine you have AI. But that actually means we need to roll data into these conversations. Now, if you start to imagine all those component pieces, how would we have an ethical conversation about each one of them, not just about the end piece? So rather than saying, well, we have an autonomous vehicle, let's consider that, can you take it back to some of the component pieces and say, what might those conversations look like and how would we have them? And in some ways, you'd start in the obvious place, which is with algorithms. There's been a tremendous amount of conversation and work, both in the press and in companies of late, talking about bias in algorithms. You heard it discussed on this stage, you read it in most publications, we know that's part and parcel of what's going on, and people are already starting to find ways of thinking about and fixing that. But ethics is a slightly different question here, right? It's not the same thing as bias. The questions here would be to start to say, what world is that algorithm modeling? What's the world that's being built? Is it just a world of finding your next date? Or is it a world of, do you get that housing loan or not? Do you get that medical insurance or not? Do you get that drug or not? What's the world that's being built there and imagined? Who decides what that world looks like? Is it fair or unfair? How are those decisions being made? On whose behalf? How and when should we intervene if we were going to intervene? And how would we evaluate if that algorithm and its impact was ethical before it had an adverse impact? So rather than waiting and going, oh, that was not a good thing, how do we roll it back and imagine you might need to start that conversation earlier? Now, of course, I know that I've just sat there and said 7 questions for which there is no simple answer, which I know is really irritating. And I'm going to do this 4 more times. So if you're irritated now, you'll be more irritated later. Because part of the challenge here is there aren't easy answers. There are just a lot of questions, and thinking about how you would address them and where becomes important. If you were doing this as a moral philosophy problem, you put some tension on the system and give you some clear, extreme examples about what that might look like. So here's one of them from my home country, where there is a big debate right now about building predictive policing tools. So could we build a tool that would start to predict certain kinds of criminal behavior and criminality? In order to do that, one of the ideas is to use existing criminal statistics. So Australia's been around for 118 years now, so we have 118 years of policing data. We can feed that, create, in some ways, an algorithm to start to say, these people are more likely to perform criminal acts than these people. And on the face of it, that seems not a bad idea. One of the ethical challenges here is that sitting inside that data are data sets, the nature of which is very different than it was when it first was collected. So from 1900 to 1985 in Australia, being gay was illegal. And you could be arrested, sentenced, and locked up for being gay. And so sitting inside that database of criminal activity is an enormous amount of data about an act that we no longer consider to be criminal. Okay, so do you take that data out and say, well, now we're going to build the database without that data? Okay, that may be one solution. What do you do about the fact that that data set also doesn't contain any data about domestic violence, because it wasn't defined as a criminal act until 1975, and it hasn't been policed until much later? So now, how do you think about inserting data into a data set in order to create a different algorithmic outcome? And I know that sounds really heavy, and I'm sorry for that, but there is this piece that says thinking about fairness and ethicalness isn't just about the outcome of the algorithm, but about what the world is that you train it on, and who gets to make those decisions about what data might be in and what data might be out and under what circumstances. And then starting to imagine, where will those conversations happen? How will they be structured? How would you debate whether it's fair or not, given that we know those things were not always straightforward and not agreed to? So you've got ethics around algorithms. There's also a set of ethical questions that you might want to frame around data. If you let me say that data is part of AI, then it clearly has ethical issues, right? I think, at least from where I sit, I sometimes think of data being AI's original sin. There are a myriad of examples where data has driven problematic outcomes in AI. Now, the ethical questions here are slightly different, though. These are questions about how was the data collected, by whom, why, under what circumstances. Was there a tacit or explicit social contract about how that data was collected? What was the expectation when that data was collected? Can that change? Was it fair? Is it good? Now, all of those questions should sound a little bit familiar, because these are all the questions that are being rehearsed around us as we speak about all kinds of personal data. But how we think about that, how we would flag those questions, again, where do they happen? Who's doing them? What does it look like? And how do we balance trade-offs inside those data sets about that? All complicated. This isn't just about a matter of having better metadata or better structured data sets. It's also about a whole series of questions about what the work is that data is doing. In Australia, we've just had a really interesting case looking at data that, in fact, for me was a really interesting moment in thinking about how you manage data sets. So there was an anthropologist named Norman Tyndale, and in the 1930s he went across the entire of Australia and collected locks of hair from Indigenous people, from Aboriginal people, and took their genealogies and took photos of them. So we had this incredible data set of Aboriginal people from across the whole country. Starting about 10 years ago, there was a move to see, could we extract DNA material from that, do a map of human movement, and actually create a scientific database of when Aboriginal people first came to Australia. That is a laudable scientific goal. The challenge was most of the Aboriginal people who had their locks of hair taken were probably not given informed consent. They weren't asked. It wasn't a good moment when that happened. And there was a moment here when you can imagine that some scientists went, listen, we have the data, we should just use it. Like, I don't care how we got it, let's just use it. Science should prevail here. But to the credit of one of the researchers on this project, he actually said, no, I think what we should do is go see if any of those people are still alive, see if we can find their families and their communities, and we should ask them now if they're okay with us doing something today with that material. And they embarked on this incredible project of finding all the descendants and asking them if they were okay about what was happening, a kind of retrospective informed consent. Now, of course, the risk there was that a whole lot of people went, yeah, no. Like, I don't think so. The reality was, of everyone who had something taken from them, only one family asked for the material not to be used. And the data that it generated was extraordinary. We can now have an eye view to how people came to Australia to populate one of the original continents, but in a way that was ethical, and where the people whose material it was felt respected in that process. I don't think we're going to have to do that for everything, but how do we imagine that, right? What would consent look like if we had to actually think about it in a meaningful manner? Now, data and algorithms are hardly things created by computing. We collected data long before we had computers. We actually had algorithms long before we had computers too. But there are technologies sitting inside AI and the constellation of technologies there that are new in their scope and their potential for impact. Sensor technology is, for me, one of those. We have a collection of technologies in the kind of portfolio of our world that have the ability to turn the whole world into real-time sensing. I'm not just talking here about cameras and the ability to hear voice. I'm not talking just about computer vision. I mean a whole lot of other things, whether it's Wi-Fi, RFID tags, wireless signal. All of those things have a capacity to sense the world around them. And the degree of fidelity there and the capacity to extract information is remarkable. That whole bundle of sensing technology will reveal much more than we once knew, and the noise is also now a signal. Where once we would have said, oh, that's just static, we can now actually see things in those patterns. Whether it's the fact that using the Wi-Fi signal in this room now and the way it is distorted by all of our presence, we could actually work out who was in the room. We can see gestures by the way our bodies change the way those signals move through the air. We can model heart rates and breathing from other sorts of wireless technology. We can even see occupancy beside and behind a wall. So sensors leak information. They say all kinds of things that they're not designed for or intended for, but they do. Now, we don't even have a language to talk about this yet. So getting to an ethical framework's quite tricky, but we know there'll be ethical questions. Is it a good thing that you can tell that I'm gesturing when I'm standing in a room by myself because my wireless network in some ways reveals that? Is that a good thing? Is that a fair thing? Is it okay for someone to see that material if I didn't know that's what having a wireless network would do? Who decides who's watching? Who's watching the watchers? Always a good question. And here you have this moment where the technical possibilities not only are running ahead of ethics, but they're running ahead of the law and our ability to imagine and signal that this stuff is happening. So what does an ethical conversation look like there? It's hard, but it's probably important. And last but by no means least, in some place, the place that I started, is to think about what does it mean to talk about whole systems in an ethical manner, whether this means autonomous vehicles, but that's just a first example, right? Now think about what it's going to mean to have AI in buildings and physical structures and streets and objects. How do you signal that? Who gets to decide what the ethical framework looks like? Who gets to decide if the building is ethical or the elevators are fair? How do we think about that? How are we going to balance the competing needs of all the people who might have a vested interest in a smart building back-ended by AI? It's one thing to say a car with a single occupant. It's another thing to think about a structure like this or a smart building. How do we balance inside of that older rules and regulations and laws that might have covered versions of those objects when they were static, but now they're dynamic and smart? How do we talk in that context about liability and trust and risk? But similarly, all the ideas again about good and bad, fair and unfair. Who gets to decide those things? Who's going to decide if a building is fair? I don't think we even have the language for thinking about that, right? We have a hard enough time saying, is that person fair? Now I'm going to say, is that building an ethical building? That's a whole set of questions I'm not sure we know how to think about. What I do know, though, is that in addressing some of those questions, we are actually going to have to move through them. Because they're not only going to be ethical questions, there will be ethical dilemmas. In the classic moral philosophical sense here, where there are multiple choices, none of which are ambiguously good, right? Where there will be trade-offs between, kind of horrible and kind of horrible. And how we make those decisions is really hard, right? It's going to put the spotlight back on problems we haven't solved. So this doesn't necessarily fix problems, but it may highlight older problems. My suspicion is people who are building, controlling, and benefiting from artificial intelligence are going to find themselves being scrutinized about precisely these questions. It puts huge tension on corporations who are profiting from AI, because here the question is about trust and about what is your motivation and about whether those are part of a calculation about ethical dilemmas. We know that AI is going to drive new regulations and new laws. We're already seeing them coming into effect in multiple jurisdictions. So all of that's going to happen, right? So what is it that we get to do in all of this? Well, I think there's two things, right? The first thing is I actually think there is an argument here about explicability and explanation. So ethics are human artifacts. They change, they adapt, they shift. They're not the best tools for making machines we can live with. But what would it take to do that, right? At the end of this week, the EU passes the GDPR regulations, so the General Data Protection Regulations, which aren't actually about AI, but they have one thread running through them that I think is a really interesting provocation and a way of thinking, which is that sitting inside the GDPR, there is a provision called the right for explanation, which means you can ask an entity to explain a particular decision or a particular outcome. Now, it's interesting to imagine what it would be like to ask an algorithmic object why a decision was made. I'm not asking necessarily for the algorithm to be able to sit there and go, I made this decision because of this, this, and this, because we're not talking about, the robots of science fiction here. But what would it mean to think about technological systems that could have a mechanism of explanation, to unpack and signal how decisions and actions were taken, to provide room then for all manner of entities to intervene, change course, redirect, and modify? Now, I know this is complicated. I may not be a computer scientist or an engineer, but I understand that asking systems to have a degree of explanation and explication is quite tricky. It's not the place we have been up until now. It certainly runs counter to some of the logic of deep learning in particular. But we know that we are building technical systems that are going to sit inside already regulated spaces. Medicine, finances, law. So how it is that we create the ability for a technical system to have an explanation is actually going to be important, but I also think it's a way of getting to systems that we could judge to be trustworthy and ethical, because at least we know how the decision was made. It may not be that you can code ethics here, but you could at least make clear how decisions were made, and that's partly how you get to a trusted framework. I said there were two things, right? I think the other thing is about how it is in all of the places we work and live, we actually don't just go straight to making technology, but we have conversations about what we're doing first. And I think we're all implicated in this. I think we're implicated that we have to follow the laws that already exist, and that's an important piece. I think we also have to make room for hard conversations here, hard, uncomfortable conversations, because there's not an easy answer, and for actually working through the dilemmas that will inevitably be surfaced here. And it's not just a matter of throwing up our hands and going, oh, it's complicated. Well, of course it's complicated. The interesting stuff always is. But how do we make room in our processes, in our companies, in our workflows for conversations about things like ethics and morality and fairness? Now, I know that's deeply discomforting. I'm a social scientist who has spent 20 years in a technology company surrounded by engineers and anthropologists, engineers and computer scientists. And I know every time I talk about people, someone goes, couldn't you just make them more like robots? It would be so much easier if they were logical and rational. I am here to tell you human beings are not logical and rational. Human beings are human beings. That's part of our great contribution and joy, but it also means that we're going to have hard conversations here as the technology gets closer and closer to human decision-making, to not just automating processes, but changing the way we do things. There are all sorts of conversations we need to have. The good news here is that that same 20 years at Intel meant that I have tremendous confidence in our ability to actually have these conversations and to manage their consequences. And frankly, I think I also have tremendous confidence in our ability to build ethical companies. Because ethical companies are what will get you to the right decisions here, or at least get you to the right conversations. So, explanation, explication, ethical companies. I think those are part of what it means to talk about ethics and AI if we just get past the trolley problem as our shorthand. And I'm really looking forward to being part of that whole conversation as it unfolds. And I hope you are too. So with that, I wanted to stop and say thank you.